Part 1. The Shadow That Never Truly Left. There are stories in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that feel like they were written by someone who truly understood grief. Not the loud kind, not the kind that performs itself in dramatic gestures and public declarations. The quiet kind. The variety that settles into bone over years and decades, pressing a little heavier each season until one day you realize it has become structural, load-bearing, so thoroughly built around that removing it would leave nothing standing. Grief that transforms a person so slowly, they barely notice until they look inward and find something staring back that they no longer recognize. Corvus Corax is one of those stories. He is not the most celebrated of the Emperor's sons. He does not have the gleaming golden authority of Robut Guillemon, who returned to the nightmare of the 41st millennium after his long injured sleep, and immediately started trying to rebuild 10,000 years of institutional decay with the systematic determination of a man who genuinely believes that if he thinks clearly enough and works hard enough, any problem can be solved. He does not have the sleeping night mythology of Lionel Johnson, who slumbered in a secret chamber beneath the rock for those same 10 millennia, only to awaken like something out of a very ancient story and immediately go looking for things to fight. He is not Sanguinius, the golden-winged angel of the Blood Angels, mourned across 10,000 years as the son whose death purchased the Emperor's final act of clarity. He is not even the tragic Magnus the Red, whose fall from grace has the operatic shape of something written specifically to be felt. No, Corvus Corax is quieter than all of them, and quieter is precisely the right word. He is the Primarch who preferred not to be seen, the one who built an entire military philosophy around the principle that the less the enemy knows about your existence and your intentions, the more effective you become. The one who operated in the dark, not because the dark was forced on him, but because he understood it, had grown up in it, had made it his element and his tool, and ultimately, over 10,000 years, his very nature. The one who faded rather than burned, who walked away rather than made a dramatic final stand, who said a single word to the galaxy that had taken everything from him and disappeared into the most hostile and incomprehensible space in the Warhammer universe. That word was nevermore, and yet 10,000 years after he walked into the Eye of Terror and vanished from every loyalist register and every Imperial record, he is still out there, still moving through a darkness that would unmake most things attempting to move through it, still hunting the enemies who destroyed his legion, still fighting in the particular way that only he knows how to fight, which is to say from positions the enemy cannot detect, against targets they did not know were vulnerable, at moments they were completely unprepared for. Still, in some irreducible sense, that 10,000 years of transformation has not managed to extinguish the consciousness that organized a revolution on a prison moon, because the people being ground into rock deserved something better than the life they had been assigned. And what the Eye of Terror has made of him in all that time changes absolutely everything. Not just about the Raven Guard, not just about the traitor Primarchs who have been hunted through their own nightmare realm for 10 millennia. It changes what is possible for the Imperium in the current era and raises questions that go to the foundation of what the Emperor actually built when he created his 20 sons. Here is the fact that matters most. Corvus Corax did not go to the Eye of Terror and die. He did not get corrupted, did not bargain with the ruinous powers, did not become a daemon prince in the way that his traitor brothers Lorgar and Fulgrim and Angron and Mortarion became daemon princes, trading their original purpose for divine patronage and terrible gifts. He went into the Eye of Terror and became something that does not fit any existing category, something that the Chaos Gods have had 10,000 years to try to deal with and have not managed to deal with satisfactorily. A being of living shadow and concentrated purpose, with 10 millennia of accumulated intelligence about the enemy's most guarded spaces. He is a loyalist entity of warp-like power, the only one of his kind in the entire setting. And if he comes back, and the current trajectory of the lore strongly suggests that is exactly what is building, nothing in the 41st millennium will be equipped to process what he has become or what he carries or what his return represents. To understand the full weight of that, you need to understand the full arc of who he was and what happened to him, and what he chose, and what those choices cost. Not just the famous moments, all of it. The weight of his return is proportional to the weight of everything that preceded it. So let us go back to the very beginning. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is there. I never get tired of seeing those come in from all over the world. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that now. It genuinely helps, and it means a great deal. Now, let us begin. Part 2. Born in Chains, Lycaeus and the Deliverer. Before there was a Primarch, before there was a Raven Guard, before there was even a name that mattered, there was a baby on a cold, airless moon, lying in the darkness of tunnels carved through rock by people who had been given nothing except chains and the instruction to make those chains profitable for someone else. That moon was Lycaeus. It orbited the forge world of Kievar, a technologically sophisticated planet whose power resided entirely in a network of ruling industrial organizations called tech guilds. These guilds had turned Lycaeus into a combined mine, prison, and industrial supply depot operating with remarkable efficiency and comprehensive inhumanity. The moon had no breathable atmosphere, so the workers lived underground in vast tunnel networks, breathing recycled air that was never quite clean or sufficient, eating rations calibrated to keep them functional rather than healthy, working shifts designed to maximize mineral extraction with complete indifference to the biological needs of the beings performing that extraction. The people of Lycaeus were not criminals in any morally meaningful sense. Some had been convicted of offenses the tech guilds defined as criminal, a category broad enough to include organizing labor disputes, publicly questioning guild policy, or failing to meet production quotas. Others were political opponents who had made themselves inconvenient. Others still were simply workers who had had a bad month or a serious illness. The system was indifferent to reason. Once sent to Lycaeus, there was no return. You worked until your body gave out, and your children inherited your chains as naturally as they inherited your eyes. The Primarch's gestation pod came down in the darkness of those tunnels. The people who found it found something they had no framework for. An infant with skin as white as bleached bone, hair as dark as the spaces between stars, and eyes with no whites at all, solid dark from edge to edge, like two pieces of the void had been pressed into a human face and left there to look out. They could have turned him over to the overseers. The calculation against hiding him was straightforward in its danger. The overseers were violent and arbitrary, in the way that people become violent and arbitrary when given absolute power over people they have been instructed to consider less than fully human. A rational, self-preserving person would have handed him over. They hid him instead. They fed him from rations that were already insufficient for their own needs. They taught him everything they knew. They gave him the name their language had for what they believed he was. Corax, the Deliverer. He grew with the preternatural speed all Primarchs shared, reaching maturity in a fraction of normal time, with knowledge somehow pre-encoded in his biology that supplemented what the slaves taught him. And what he did with that education was not what simple rage would have suggested. Rage would have been understandable. He organized instead. He observed the structure of what he faced before moving against it. He thought systematically about where power was actually located and where its real vulnerabilities could be found. He developed, from first principles in tunnels on a prison moon, the analytical framework for asymmetric conflict that professional military institutions spend generations trying to teach and usually fail to fully transmit, because the knowledge can only be truly internalized by someone who has no other options. He also discovered his psychic ability, the shadow walk, the capacity to meld with darkness in a way that went beyond concealment. He did not simply move quietly or exploit the limitations of enemy senses. He became part of the shadow in some essential way that his enemies' perceptions could not process. People looking directly at the space he occupied found their attention sliding away, their focus refusing to settle, some deep mechanism in their perception insisting there was nothing there worth attending to. In a tunnel system run by armed overseers whose entire model depended on surveillance and control, this was an ability of devastating practical significance. The revolt he organized was years in preparation. Small, independent cells that could not unravel each other if discovered. People trained in hit-and-run tactics in the tunnels, they knew far better than any garrison force. Specific structural points in the control system identified where simultaneous coordinated pressure would produce the fastest collapse. When the moment came, it moved with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly the right conditions. When the tech guilds of Kievar retaliated with military force, Corax refused to fight the fight they were offering. He retreated into the tunnels they knew better than anyone, and bled the military units through ambush and sabotage and the intimate geography of a place that had been his people's home for generations. And then he aimed the decisive blow not at the soldiers but at the factories. 5 atomic mining charges sent down the supply gravity well to the 5 biggest industrial cities on Kievar's surface. Thousands died in those bombardments. He knew they would. He made the calculation anyway, with clear eyes, because the alternative was the continuation of a system that would grind through millions of lives indefinitely. He counted the dead clearly and accepted the weight of it and lived with what that meant. He did not pretend otherwise. Lycaeus was renamed Deliverance. The Emperor arrived to find his lost son. They spent a day and a night alone together, and nothing of what was said was preserved. When they emerged, Corax had accepted command of the 19th Legion, and the Emperor had committed to genuine peace and reconstruction for Kievar rather than simple extraction. The very first thing Corax asked for when given a Space Marine Legion was for the people of the world he grew up alongside to be treated decently. Not territory, not resources, not recognition. Decency for the people who had hidden him and fed him and taught him when they had nothing to give. The Black Tower that had housed the Overseer's garrison became the Ravenspire, the symbol of every system that had shaped him, converted into the house from which the people who had overcome that system would go out into the galaxy. That was intentional. Everything Corax did was intentional. Part 3. The Liberator and his Legion, a doctrine forged from below. The Great Crusade was more than a century old when Corvus Corax took command of the 19th Legion, and the methods of that campaign varied enormously from legion to legion, reflecting the personalities and priorities of the Primarchs who led them. Some legions were hammers. They came in overwhelming force, hit until nothing could resist, and moved on. The World Eaters under Angron were the extreme expression of this, but they were far from alone in the general approach. Even more disciplined, legions like the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists operated from the foundational assumption that sufficiently organized conventional force, applied with sufficient competence, would prevail against any opposition eventually. Corax was not going to build something like any of those, and the reason was not primarily philosophical. His entire understanding of warfare had been developed in a context where overwhelming force was always on the other side of the equation, where his resources were minimal and the power arrayed against him was enormous, and the question of how to win was therefore never about how to apply superior force, but always about how to make the other side's superior force irrelevant to the outcome. He had learned warfare from the position of the people the legions were most often deployed against, not from the position of the legions themselves, and that inverted perspective produced an inverted doctrine. The 19th Legion he inherited had existed for over a century before finding their Primarch, shaped during that period by Terran officers whose approaches included things that Corax found genuinely repugnant. The same logic of occupation and control that he had grown up watching applied to the people around him on Lycaeus. He dealt with this systematically. The officers who had shaped those practices were moved out of positions of influence. The culture of the Legion was rebuilt from the ground up around different principles. What he built is worth understanding in detail, because the Raven Guard's doctrine is one of the most internally consistent and philosophically coherent approaches to warfare in the entire setting, and that coherence comes from the fact that it was developed by someone whose life had been a sustained, practical lesson in its principles, rather than a theoretical framework applied from outside. The foundational principle was information dominance over force dominance. Most legions operated on the assumption that Space Marines' vast superiority to any opposition made the primary question one of delivering that superiority efficiently. Corax rejected this not because it was wrong about Space Marine capability, but because it was incomplete about what military success required. The enemy you know nothing about, fighting on their own chosen ground on their own timetable, is capable of inflicting costs that superior capability alone cannot prevent. He had proved this on Lycaeus. He had been the inferior force, and he had won, precisely because he had understood the problem's structure, while his opponents had assumed their advantages would be decisive. He built the Raven Guard around, knowing more about the fight than the enemy does, before engaging it at all. Before any major operation, before the first Raven Guard ship came near visible detection range of a target, intelligence elements were already working. Infiltrators embedded in populations, scouts mapping defensive architecture, covert teams tracking command structures and logistical dependencies. The real locations of things that mattered, as opposed to the obvious things, displayed prominently because the enemy wanted them seen. By the time the Raven Guard's main elements moved, they knew more about how the target defended itself than the defenders knew about themselves. When the main elements struck, they struck against the specific things that made organized resistance possible, not primarily against the fighters, but against the infrastructure, making those fighters capable of coordinated action. Communication systems, command nodes, supply chains, the specific humans whose removal would degrade the opposition's organizational coherence most significantly. An opposition whose commanders cannot communicate with their forces is not an army anymore. It is confused individuals in armor who do not know what is happening or how to coordinate a response. The Raven Guard would frequently arrive at direct engagement with an enemy already in that disorganized state, and the direct engagement was then faster and far less costly than it would have been otherwise. This approach had profound effects on casualties in multiple directions. Fewer Raven Guard died. But Corax also genuinely cared about minimizing harm to civilian populations of the worlds he brought into compliance, in a way that went beyond strategic calculation. He cared because the people living in those cities were the same category of people as the slaves of Lycaeus, caught in the path of forces far beyond their control. If you could bring a world to heel by removing its command structure and demonstrating organized resistance was functionally impossible, you did not have to fight through its population centers and produce rubble and mass civilian casualties and generational resentment. The specialized equipment the Raven Guard developed reflected this doctrine with perfect consistency. The Shadowhawk, their variant of the Thunderhawk gunship, was rebuilt with every available technology for reducing acoustic, thermal, and electromagnetic signatures until it was functionally undetectable by most defensive systems. The Whisper Cutter was more radical still, an open-frame vehicle built around a gravitic impeller that could deliver 10 fully armored Space Marines in complete silence, with almost no detectable heat signature, with effectively no radar return. This was not Mechanicum technology. It was built by the craftsmen of Kievar, the former subjects of the tech guilds, now redirecting their engineering capabilities toward liberation rather than extraction. His relationship with Horus during the Great Crusade was a study in friction between two fundamentally different ways of thinking about power and obligation. The Raven Guard frequently served under the War Master's broader command, and Corax's capabilities made his legion genuinely valuable. But Horus understood people primarily as resources, to be managed and deployed in service of objectives, and Corax had grown up surrounded by people being treated that way, and recognized the logic in every form it took. The incident that formalized their poor relationship involved the Battle of Gate 42, where Horus made decisions about deploying Terran-born Space Marines that Corax found morally indefensible, treating them as expendable pressure rather than as warriors whose lives had genuine worth. The confrontation came close to violence between Primarchs. Corax subsequently arranged for the Raven Guard to operate under different command authority. In the retrospective light of what Horus became, this looks like prescience. At the time, it was simply a man with very good instincts about people who did not like what those instincts were telling him. When the galaxy broke open and Horus revealed himself, Corax was not surprised. He was devastated by the scale, but not surprised. The tragedy is that his perception could not save him from what came next. Part 4. Black Sands, the Drop Site Massacre at Istvan V. There are events in any story universe that function less like battles and more like tectonic events, moments that reorganize the structural logic of everything around them so completely that all subsequent history can only be understood in relationship to them. The Drop Site Massacre at Istvan V is one of those. And for Corvus, Corax, and the Raven Guard specifically, it is the defining catastrophe, the black line drawn across their history that they have never fully crossed back over. When Horus revealed his rebellion, the forces closest to the Istvan system were 3 legions: the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulcan, and the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax. They were ordered to Istvan V, believing they were bringing justice to a war master who had betrayed everything. Their combined force was enormous. The Raven Guard arrived with approximately 79,000 Space Marines. The Salamanders brought around 83,000. The Iron Hands came with approximately 10,000 in Ferrus Manus's vanguard. Combined total, roughly 172,000 Astartes. They had been told that 4 other legions were coming as reinforcement: the Word Bearers, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion. All 4 had already secretly committed to Horus's rebellion. The second wave was not reinforcement. It was a trap constructed over years of careful preparation. The first wave landed and fought across the black sands of the Urgal Depression with everything they had. Corax personally engaged Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word Bearers, in direct combat and nearly killed him. Only Conrad Kurz's physical intervention, taking serious wounds in the process, allowed Lorgar to escape. Corax was badly wounded, disengaged, and continued fighting. But that near kill mattered, in ways that would echo through everything that followed. Then, the second wave arrived and turned. What followed was not a battle. The Loyalists were caught between 2 forces simultaneously, and they were simply destroyed. The killing lasted hours. The numbers tell the story with a coldness that is difficult to process. The Iron Hands lost approximately 92% of the forces they committed. The Salamanders lost approximately 96%. The Raven Guard lost approximately 92%. Of the 79,000 Raven Guard who made planetfall, believing they were going to deliver justice, 4,724 survived. In total, across all 3 legions, approximately 163,986 Space Marines died on Istvan V. Ferrus Manus was beheaded by Fulgrim, who had been so thoroughly corrupted by a Slaneshi demon that the cultured Primarch, who had been Ferrus's closest friend, was barely present in the thing that killed him. Corax survived. He fought for 98 days after the initial massacre, leading the surviving Raven Guard in a guerrilla campaign across the surface of Istvan V, with no reinforcements, no resupply, no prospect of anything except delaying the inevitable. He did what he had always done when the force disparity was impossible: hit and retreated and disappeared and hit again, keeping people alive through tactical discipline and the refusal to stop moving. Rescue came eventually through a channel that sits uncomfortably at the border between military planning and something stranger. Captain Bran Nev, left in reserve on Deliverance, was driven to mount an extraction mission by recurring dreams experienced by an Imperial Army officer attached to the Raven Guard. Dreams specific enough about Corax's situation on Istvan V to direct a rescue mission that should not have succeeded. What Corax carried back was not only the survivors. He carried 74,000 dead brothers. He carried the knowledge that forces he had served alongside had constructed this destruction over years of careful preparation. He carried Lorgar, still alive behind him, the architect of the entire catastrophe, walking away from it intact. He returned to Terra and asked the Emperor for what he needed to rebuild. The Emperor provided access to a hidden laboratory containing genetic secrets deeper than anything the Mechanicum possessed, the undifferentiated Primarch genetic template itself. Corax took it back to Deliverance, and the second catastrophe began to build. Part 5. The Raptor Program Desperation and Its Consequences. Of all the choices Corax made across his history, the Raptor Program resists simple moral judgment most stubbornly, and that resistance is part of what makes it so important to his story. It was not evil. It was not corruption. It was the act of a deeply principled man who had watched almost everything he built be destroyed in a few hours, looking at the mathematical reality of what remained and trying desperately to find a way to put something together quickly enough to matter. The mathematics were genuinely brutal. Creating a Space Marine through the standard process takes years. The Raven Guard's gene seed had been showing instability even before the heresy. The Legion was working with 4,000 724 survivors from a starting point of 79,000. The Horus heresy was not going to wait for them to rebuild at whatever pace standard processes could support. The genetic material the Emperor had provided offered a different path. Using the undifferentiated Primarch template, combined with accelerated development techniques, Corax and his chief apothecary developed a gene seed variant that could produce new Raven Guard in months rather than years. The warriors it created, designated raptors, matured faster than standard Astartes, were physically superior in multiple measurable dimensions, and could be produced at a rate that could actually change the Legion's situation in the time frame that mattered. The early raptors appeared to work. They fought. They gave the Raven Guard something that looked like a path back from extinction. And then the mutations began. They came slowly at first, subtle enough to rationalize as individual variation. But as more raptors were created and more time passed, the pattern became too consistent and too severe to explain away. Warriors who had seemed perfectly formed began to transform. Bones grew in configurations with no anatomical logic. Flesh reshaped itself according to some principle that was not biological, producing protrusions and arrangements that served no function and that evidently caused considerable suffering to the warriors experiencing them. Faces lost their architecture. What had been Space Marines became something that retained cognitive capability and personality, while the body dissolved away from what bodies are supposed to be. The horror at the center of the Raptor program is not simply that it failed. It is that the mutations left the warriors conscious and aware of exactly what was happening. They knew. They remembered who they had been. They could communicate, think, feel, form, and express preferences and fears. And they were in bodies continuously transforming towards something that barely fit the category of living thing, and nothing could stop it. What Corax did not know was that the Alpha Legion had been working against him. Infiltrators disguised as surviving, Raven Guard had quietly contaminated the gene tech the Raptor program depended on, introducing a chaos taint into the genetic foundation of the process. Every Raptor created after that contamination was carrying the consequence. When Corax understood what had happened, he shut the program down completely. He purged every Alpha Legion infiltrator he could identify. He ended the accelerated process, absolutely. And then he faced the question that had no good answer. What to do with the warriors, who were already too far changed to be saved, who were suffering in transformations that were going to continue, regardless of anything anyone did. He gave them the Emperor's peace, personally, with his own hands. His own warriors, his own attempt to rebuild what had been taken, turned against itself by the same enemy who had orchestrated the original destruction. And the responsibility for ending that suffering fell on him because there was no one else. After the heresy ended, he reorganized the surviving Raven Guard according to Guilliman's Codex, establishing the successor chapters, attending to the formal business of transition with methodical efficiency. Then he spent a year alone in the highest chamber of the Ravenspire. His officers stood outside and heard, occasionally, through the stone, a single word repeated in the tone of a man who has gone somewhere interior that other people cannot reach. Nevermore. 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 When he emerged, he completed whatever remaining business required attention, organized the last details, said what needed to be said. Then he said his word one final time, publicly, in front of whatever witnesses happened to be present, and walked away. He set course for the Eye of Terror. Part 6. Into the Nightmare. The Logic of the Departure. Understanding why Corax walked into the Eye of Terror rather than simply continuing to fight in the material universe requires understanding the specific texture of the situation he was in, understanding it not as a strategic decision, but as the last available act of a consciousness that had exhausted every other form for what it needed to express. He had tried the constructive response. After Istvan V, he had obtained the Emperor's help and developed the Raptor program and worked toward restoring the Raven Guard to something capable of fighting. That attempt had been corrupted by the same enemy who orchestrated the initial catastrophe, turned from a path forward into a second disaster, worse in some ways than the first, because it involved his own best effort, becoming the instrument of harm. He had tried the organizational response. After the heresy, he had reorganized the Legion per the Codex, established the successor chapters, ensured the continuity of doctrine and culture and institutional knowledge. He had done all of this with systematic competence, and it had not addressed the specific thing that remained unresolved. He had tried what might be called grief, in the specific private form available to him. A year alone in a tower, repeating a single word. None of it touched the central fact. Lorgar was alive. The word-bearers were operational. The Night Lords who turned at Istvan V were operational. The Alpha Legion that sabotaged the gene tech was operational. All of them were in the Eye of Terror, and that specific arrangement was simply not something he could continue to sustain. There is something both terrible and completely human about this motivation, especially given that Corax was a being defined by patient discipline over emotional response, who had organized a revolution through years of preparation rather than spontaneous reaction. The man who had always chosen the fight that suited him rather than the fight being offered, who had built an entire philosophy around never letting the enemy dictate the terms of engagement, walked into the most hostile place in the universe because he was grieving and could not think of anywhere else to put it. In the end, principle yielded to something more basic than principle. He needed to go to where the people who had done this were, and do to them what he had been designed to do to enemies of the Emperor, not as a strategic mission, not as an authorized operation, as the last available expression of a grief that had exhausted every other form. The Raven Guard who were present when he left did not try to stop him. They were too thoroughly trained in his own doctrine, too deeply schooled in the principle that when a being has identified the target and committed to the approach, intervention based on concerns about what comes after is interference rather than support. They watched him go. They recorded the word. They went back to their work. The silence where he had been became as structural and defining as everything he had built while he was present. An absence felt in everything the Raven Guard did and said and maintained and practiced for 10,000 years, carried as part of what they were. Part 7. What the warp made of him. The shadow entity. The Eye of Terror is not a place in the conventional sense, and this is worth establishing clearly because treating it as a place, as a location, with consistent physical properties and reliable spatial relationships, leads to misunderstanding what it does to beings that spend time inside it. It is a region where the barrier between the material universe and the immaterium, the psychic dimension where emotion becomes substance and the chaos gods dwell, has become so thin as to be effectively absent in places. Physics does not apply uniformly. Time does not maintain consistent relationships with itself. Matter can be reshaped by will or emotion or the intentions of the entities that govern that space. The stable assumptions that allow material beings to function are not honored there. For a mortal, exposure to the raw warp inside the eye would be rapidly and comprehensively fatal. For a Primarch, the situation operates by fundamentally different rules, and understanding why explains what happened to Corax. The Emperor designed his sons with warp energy incorporated into their fundamental nature at a level that most analytical frameworks cannot fully account for. Every Primarch is, in some sense, the setting's own theology cannot fully articulate, a being of two natures simultaneously, partly physical, bound to matter and its laws, and partly something else, a psychic essence or consciousness, more substantive and more persistent than anything purely mortal beings produce. Their extraordinary physical capabilities, their psychic gifts, the almost supernatural magnetism they exert, all of these come from that dual nature. A Primarch who spends enough time in the raw warp will not simply die. The physical aspect of their nature will be affected, but the psychic essence, the actual seat of their identity and capability, will respond differently. Exposed to the warp's energies without the mediation of a physical shell operating in normal space, it will interact with those energies. It will develop in directions that the physical shell had previously constrained. It will become more fully what it always was, stripped of the limitations that had previously governed how it could express itself. This is what happened to Corvus Corax. Slowly, over years that became decades, that became centuries, that became millennia, the warp stripped away what the lore calls the mortal facade, the physical shell and all the habits and limitations of physical existence, and revealed the warp-formed consciousness that had always been there beneath the surface. The thing the Emperor actually built when he made Corvus Corax exposed and given space to develop and freed from the constraints that had previously governed it. For Corax, whose defining psychic characteristic had always been the shadow walk, the connection to shadow and darkness he had possessed since his earliest consciousness on Lycaeus, the transformation had a specific and internally consistent direction. The ability to meld with shadows deepened and expanded as the constraints governing it were removed. The discipline of controlling the shadow walk, which had required conscious effort when he was a physical being, became something more fundamental, more integrated with his nature at the most basic level. He did not use the shadows anymore. He became them, in whatever sense those words apply to a consciousness that has undergone 10,000 years of this process. The being that Corax became inside the eye is described in the lore as a humanoid entity made of blades and living darkness, a consciousness that could exist as a coherent physical form, dissolve into pure shadow, or disperse into an enormous flock of ravens that were not biological organisms but manifestations of his psychic will given temporary material form. Light did not merely fail to illuminate him, it fled from him, pulled away from his presence the way water pulls back from a surface hot enough to prevent contact, leaving an absence that had weight and intent behind it. He was not a chaos entity. The lore states this with enough emphasis that it clearly matters enormously. When Lorgar Aurelian, the daemon primarch of the Wordbearers, who has spent 10,000 years inside the eye and who has every reason to be able to identify what is and is not demonic in his domain, encounters Corax in the events surrounding the Great Rift, he states explicitly, "This is no daemon. Corax is not serving the ruinous powers. He is not connected to any of the 4 chaos gods. He made no bargains, received no gifts, accepted no patronage. His transformation is not corruption. It is development. The natural and internally consistent development of a consciousness whose most fundamental characteristic was always a deep connection to shadow and darkness. Given 10,000 years, in an environment where that characteristic could develop without the physical constraints that had previously governed it. The chaos gods cannot corrupt what does not want to be corrupted, and what is not susceptible to their specific vectors. They can affect things through sustained exposure, but that effect does not necessarily produce corruption. Sometimes it produces something else, something that uses the tools and terrain of their domain without belonging to or serving them. Something that, for all their power and 10,000-year advantage in understanding the space Corax has been operating in, they may not have fully anticipated. What the traitor legions inside the eye have experienced for 10,000 years is a predator in their midst who knows their positions, their habits, their organizational structures, who can reach into the most heavily defended daemon world and remove specific targets with apparent impunity, who cannot be tracked or cornered or confronted on any terms except the ones he chooses. A persistent, unavoidable cost. A shadow over everything they do. A reminder that the galaxy outside the eye is not the only place where their enemies exist. That shadow has been growing more capable, more refined, more deeply knowledgeable about the specific weaknesses of every specific enemy in there for 10,000 years. Part 8. The Encounter with Lorgar Confirmation. The Shadow Still Hunts. Of all the documented encounters with what Corvus Corax has become, the confrontation with Lorgar Aurelian is the most significant. The clearest confirmation available through the current lore that the Raven Lord is alive, that his capabilities have developed in the directions the transformation suggests, and that the purpose driving him into the eye has not been abandoned or corrupted in 10,000 years. Lorgar was the primarch of the Wordbearers, and was, in the architecture of how the Horus heresy happened, perhaps the most foundational figure in the entire catastrophe. He was the first primarch to turn to chaos worship. He conducted the galaxy-spanning pilgrimage that confirmed the chaos god's existence and established the theological foundation within which the rebellion was subsequently organized and justified. He converted his entire legion from loyal servants into the first Space Marine chaos cult over decades of secret preparation. He was the ideological architect, the man who believed so absolutely and so catastrophically that the Emperor was a god deserving worship, and who built an entirely new theological system around the entities that actually responded to his devotion when the Emperor rejected it. After the siege of Terra failed and the traitor legions retreated into the Eye, Lorgar went into extended seclusion on a daemon world that the warp had reshaped into a physical expression of his faith. He withdrew from the active campaigning. Other daemon primarchs continued to pursue. Part of the reason was fear. Lorgar, the daemon primarch of the Wordbearers, sustained and enhanced by 10,000 years of divine patronage from the Chaos gods, was afraid of Corvus Corax. This fear predated the heresy. During Lorgar's pilgrimage into the Eye before the heresy formally began, a daemonic guide told him specifically that if he ever fought Corax in earnest, he would be killed. Every subsequent interaction reinforced rather than resolved this. The near-death at Istvan V, where Corax had him before Conrad Kurz's intervention, the persistent awareness that something was hunting the traitor legions in their own territory, that their conventional defensive measures were not reliably effective against. Consider what it means for a daemon primarch to be afraid. Lorgar is not afraid of many things. He has been comprehensively transformed by 10,000 years of chaos patronage, is connected to immense reserves of warp energy the chaos gods can channel through their champions, operates in an environment that is essentially his home territory, surrounded by forces that serve him and the powers he represents. His fear is not the fear of a being untested or without developed defenses. It is the fear of a being that has been specifically tested by Corax, and that has specific knowledge of what that test involves. The confrontation confirming Corax's current state occurred during the events surrounding the fall of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift. Corax found Lorgar's daemon world, entered the sanctuary Lorgar had built as his fortress and his home and his place of power, and attacked. Lorgar, fighting in his own sanctuary with the full resources of his faith and his patron powers available, was forced to draw on those resources at their maximum in order to force Corax back and escape into a fortified sanctum. He survived, but he survived by calling for help and retreating, not by defeating or driving away what had come for him. A daemon primarch, in his own domain, in his own fortress, called for help because he could not defeat in open combat the entity that had come hunting him. The implications are significant. Lorgar, at his current level of development and divine enhancement, is among the most powerful individual entities on the traitor side of the conflict. His survival of the encounter is less about his capacity to overcome Corax than about the defensive resources available to a daemon primarch in his own sanctum. Corax came close enough that those defensive resources had to be called upon, and the margin was not comfortable. The encounter also establishes something with specific implications for the future. Lorgar, as a daemon prince, cannot be permanently ended by being killed in the material universe. He would return to the warp and reform over time. Ending him permanently requires engaging his soul in the warp itself in a way that prevents reformation. This is not something any conventional loyalist force is positioned to accomplish. It requires the ability to operate in the warp as a combatant, to pursue and engage a warp-native entity in its own domain. Corax is positioned to accomplish this. He operates in the warp. He is the only loyalist entity in the setting that is positioned to change what permanently ending a daemon primarch means. The encounter with Lorgar is therefore not only confirmation that Corax exists and fights and pursues the purpose that sent him into the Eye. It is a preview of what his return to the material universe would make possible that is currently not possible for any other loyalist entity in the setting. Part 9. The return that changes everything implications across the setting. What a formal return of Corvus Corax to the material universe would mean for the Warhammer 40,000 setting as it currently exists is not a simple question. The implications extend in multiple directions simultaneously and touch every major aspect of the current conflict. The era Indomitus is defined by disruption on a scale the setting has not seen since the heresy itself. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy along a massive chain of warp storms, effectively cutting Imperial territory in half, disrupting the Astronomicon over significant portions of the galaxy, and severing the communication and travel networks that allowed the Imperium to function as anything approaching a coherent civilization. Threats, the setting has always contained, are pressing simultaneously on an Imperium that can no longer respond to all of them coherently. Guilliman's return addressed some of this. His extraordinary administrative and strategic intelligence, applied to the problem of stabilizing the Imperium, has produced real results. The Indomitus Crusade represents a genuine effort to push back rather than simply endure. Lion L. Johnson's return has been more personal, focused on the specific tragedy of the Dark Angels and the resolution of the 10,000-year schism between Loyal Chapter and the Fallen. Corax returning would be something different from both, and the difference is worth articulating precisely. Guilliman returned as a leader, a visible and authoritative figure around whom the Imperium's surviving structures can organize and from whom direction can flow outward. The Lion returned primarily as a warrior and as a figure of personal authority for his specific chapter. Corax was never a leader in Guilliman's sense and was never primarily a warrior in the Lion's sense, and what he has become is further still from both of those categories. He is a hunter and a strategist of a very specific kind, a being who understands power by understanding where its real weaknesses are, and who exploits those weaknesses with methodical precision, operating in the spaces between conventional military engagement rather than within those engagements. And what the Eye of Terror has made of him is a version of that identity developed to its fullest possible expression in the most demanding possible environment. If he returns, he does not return to be visible or to be institutionally authoritative. He does not return to sit on councils or lead crusades in any form, the narrative categories for returned Primarchs have established so far. He returns as the one thing the Imperium has never had before, in 10,000 years of conflict with the forces of chaos. A loyalist entity with the ability to operate inside the Eye of Terror and engage the traitor forces where they actually live, combined with 10,000 years of direct observation of those forces in their home territory. Think about what that intelligence is actually worth. The Imperium has been fighting the traitor legions for 10,000 years without ever having reliable, current, direct intelligence on what those forces are actually doing inside the Eye. Every piece of information about what happens in there is filtered through sources whose reliability is inherently questionable, whose access is limited by the fundamental hostility of the environment to anyone who does not belong there. The Inquisition's files on the internal dynamics of the traitor legions are a collection of fragments and educated guesses and accounts from survivors who may themselves have been unreliable narrators. Corax has been a direct observer inside the Eye for 10,000 years. He has watched the traitor legions develop, change, expand, contract, and conflict with each other. He knows which of the traitor Primarchs are at their most vulnerable and in what specific ways. He knows the internal dynamics and territorial disputes and theological conflicts that divide the traitor forces from each other in ways that external observation cannot detect. He knows what has changed in 10,000 years, and what has remained constant, and what has become more dangerous, and what has become less so. None of this information is available anywhere in the material universe. Corax returning with it would represent the most significant single intelligence windfall in the Imperium's history since before the heresy. The strategic implications touch every aspect of how the conflict between the Imperium and the traitor legions is conducted. But the intelligence is only the beginning. Consider the operational capabilities he brings. The traitor Primarchs are daemon princes. They cannot be permanently ended by being destroyed in the material universe, only temporarily forced back to the warp where they reform over time. The Imperium has never had any means of pursuing them into the warp and engaging them there, preventing the reformation that allows them to return. Corax is the only loyalist entity in the setting position to change this, to pursue these specific beings into the warp and engage them on their own ground. He has already demonstrated he can push Lorgar, a daemon Primarch of the Wordbearers, in his own sanctum to the point of needing divine intervention to escape. The path from that demonstration to permanently ending Lorgar, which would require destroying his soul in the warp rather than simply defeating his physical manifestation, is not a short path. But it is a path that exists with Corax's involvement in ways it did not exist before. The same logic applies in varying degrees to every traitor Primarch. Each is more vulnerable to being permanently ended if there is a loyalist warp entity that can pursue them past the point where they retreat. Corax is the only candidate for that role. There is also the effect on the Chaos Gods' strategic calculations. They have operated for 10,000 years with a comfortable understanding of their advantages. They own the warp. Their servants are native to the space that loyalist forces can only enter with great difficulty and at great cost. Corax's existence inside the Eye for 10,000 years as a loyalist entity without being claimed or destroyed represents a genuine anomaly in their model of the conflict. If he formalizes his return to the material universe and begins operating as an active component of the loyalist side's military strategy, the Chaos Gods are dealing with something their frameworks were not built to accommodate. Part 10. What changes for the Raven Guard, an inheritance, finally understood. The Raven Guard have been, for 10,000 years, a chapter defined in significant part by an absence. Not by failure, not broken or incapable. They conduct their operations with the methodical precision and patient discipline that Corax built into their culture, and they do so with consistent, exceptional effectiveness. They achieve things other chapters would find difficult or impossible. They are genuinely among the setting's finest specialized forces. But they carry something other chapters do not carry, in quite the same way. A quality difficult to name precisely, but recognizable when you look at the Raven Guard's history and culture and self-understanding. It is the quality of a people who are in the middle of a story that has not finished, who know the central fact of their history, but not its conclusion, who have been maintaining a legacy and a practice and a tradition in the faith, that those things have value even in the absence of the being who created them. Their gene seed expresses in ways that connect them physically to their Primarch. The pale skin, the dark hair, the eyes that tend toward solid black, these are common enough to be characteristic, visible markers of the genetic inheritance they carry. But the sable brand is the deeper expression, a psychic condition that manifests in some Raven Guard warriors as an intensifying, potentially overwhelming connection to shadow and darkness, a pull toward what Corax was at his most fundamental level that can become, in the individuals most strongly affected, something that consumes rather than simply informs. The chapter developed the trifold path of shadow over generations of grappling with this condition, a framework for helping brothers channel the connection productively rather than be dominated by it. This is genuinely sensible and represents real institutional wisdom accumulated through careful observation. But it is also inevitably the management framework of people who understand the Sable brand only from the outside, who have never had access to what that connection to shadow looks like when it is fully realized rather than carefully constrained, who have developed their framework through watching and recording and theorizing rather than through direct knowledge of actually being what the Sable brand is, a weaker expression of. Corax is the direct knowledge. He is not someone who has managed the Sable brand and developed insight from that management. He is what the Sable brand is a distant echo of, the full development of the psychic connection to shadow that his gene seed carries in diluted and physically constrained forms in his successors. He has spent 10,000 years experiencing and developing what Raven Guard warriors who show the Sable brand are experiencing a muted version of in the most extreme environment that characteristic could possibly be developed in. If Corax returns and engages with his sons, even in limited ways, the implications for how the chapter understands itself and its own capabilities are significant in ways that go beyond inspiration or symbolism. Every warrior who has experienced the Sable brand and been managed through it by the trifold path would have access, for the first time, to evidence of what that connection becomes when allowed to develop fully rather than being carefully constrained, not as something that destroys or corrupts, as the genuine full expression of something the Raven Guard have always been carrying and have never fully understood because its full expression has never been available for observation. This changes the framework within which the Sable brand can be understood, taught, and worked with, potentially in ways that allow it to be a capability rather than a condition requiring management. The distinction between those two framings of the same thing is enormous in terms of what a warrior can do with it and how the chapter understands its own identity. The practical effects on battlefield capabilities would be significant. Their doctrine is already one of the most sophisticated approaches to asymmetric warfare in the setting. The addition of guidance from a being who has spent 10,000 years refining exactly those capabilities in the most demanding possible environment who has developed specific techniques for operating in environments that conventional Space Marine doctrine has no framework for, who has learned things about the warp itself and about the forces of chaos from a position of direct extended engagement, could open approaches to the conflict that are currently not available to the Raven Guard at all. For the successor chapters, the Raptors and the Revelers and the Blackguard, and the others carrying variants of the Raven Guard's gene seed, the implications extend similarly. Each has developed independently over centuries and millennia, finding their own relationship with the specific characteristics and challenges that come with carrying Corax's genetic material. The return of the source of that material, the consciousness whose nature all of these adaptations are ultimately adaptations of, creates the possibility of a reconnection and a shared context for understanding what they all are. There is also the question of what his return means for how the chapters defining history is taught and understood internally. The Drop Site Massacre, the Raptor Program, the Departure. These are the three defining catastrophes of the Raven Guard's history, and they are taught as such, carried through the chapter's rituals and traditions as permanent reference points. They are presented, correctly, as losses. The dead are real. The Raptor Program's horror is real. The departure is real, and its cost to the sons who were left behind is real. A Corax who returns does not erase any of that history, but he changes what it means by changing what comes after it. The departure was not the conclusion. The Nevermore was not the final word. The story that appeared to end with a Primarch walking away into the nightmare continued in that nightmare for 10,000 years and is now potentially finding its way back. That is a different shape of story from the one where the departure is the final chapter, and it is the difference between a history of loss and a history that contains loss on the way to something else. The Raven Guard have been insisting, through 10,000 years of practice and maintenance and continuation, that the story was not over. They did not know if they were right. A Corax who comes back does not vindicate that faith in any comfortable or simple way, because the person who comes back is not the person who left, and the 10,000 years were real, and everything that happened in them was real. But it does mean that the faith was not misplaced in the most fundamental sense. The story was not over. The Nevermore was not the final answer. Part 11. Theories and the pattern that changes everything. The broader question Corax's situation poses for the Warhammer 40,000 narrative extends well beyond his individual story. It is a question about the design of the Primarchs themselves, about what the Emperor actually built into his sons, beyond the obvious capabilities on display during the Great Crusade, and the answer has implications for every Primarch still unaccounted for. The lore describing what happened to Corax inside the Eye frames his transformation not as something unique to him, but as the revelation of something true about all Primarchs. The warp, over sufficient time and intensity of exposure, strips away the mortal facade and reveals the warp-formed consciousness beneath. The specific form of that consciousness varies by individual, shaped by whatever essential characteristics the Emperor encoded into each son. For Corax, that essential characteristic was the connection to shadow and darkness, present since his earliest consciousness on Lycaeus, amplified to its fullest possible expression by 10,000 years of the Eye's transformation. What this implies for the other missing Primarchs deserves serious consideration. Leman Russ announced before his departure, in approximately 211 M31, that he would return for the final battle. He has been inside the Eye of Terror for approximately 10,000 years. His fundamental essential characteristics were ferocity and pack loyalty, and a connection to the hunt and to combat that was more primal and instinctive than almost any of his brothers. It expressed itself in his personal fighting style, in his legion's culture, in the specific shape of all his relationships. 10,000 years of the warp stripping the mortal facade from those characteristics and allowing the warp-formed consciousness beneath to develop the way Corax's has developed would produce something. The Space Wolves believe it will be appropriate to whatever final battle their mythology points toward. Given Corax's example, dismissing this is not rational. Jagatai Khan entered the Webway rather than the Eye, pursuing Dark Eldar raiders striking at Chogoris. The Webway is not the Eye in terms of its specific properties, but it has its own relationship with the warp and with the development of beings spending extended periods within it. The Khan's fundamental characteristics were speed and precision and the philosophy of the perfect strike, the intuitive understanding that warfare at its highest expression is about timing rather than force. Whatever the Webway has done with 10,000 years of those characteristics is presumably consistent with them in the way Corax's transformation is consistent with his. The theory that best accommodates this evidence is that the Emperor built into his sons a second tier of capability that was never triggered under the conditions of the Great Crusade. The Primarchs were built to lead the legions and conduct the crusade. They were extraordinary at this. But the Emperor, whose planning operated on timescales mortals cannot comprehend, may have built into them something beyond the capabilities needed for the crusade, something that would be unlocked by specific adversities, something that the tragedies and losses and departures that the heresy produced, as terrible as they were, may have been necessary preconditions for. If this is the design, the missing Primarchs are not simply waiting somewhere, they are becoming. Each in the specific way their particular essential characteristics point toward, each developed by the specific environment and experiences of their particular disappearance, each moving towards something that the Great Crusade versions of themselves could not have been. Corax is the clearest evidence for this pattern because he is the one we have the most information about in terms of what his transformation has produced. He went in as a wounded Primarch, whose grief was unresolvable by any means available in the material universe. He emerged, at least in the partial emergence demonstrated by the encounter with Lorgar, as something that has had 10,000 years to become exactly and completely what he was always fundamentally going to be. Not a more powerful version of the Raven Guard Primarch. Something that encompasses and transcends that. The full development of the essential nature that the Raven Guard Primarch was always an early expression of, not larger than what he was, more concentrated, more refined, more precisely itself, not expanded outward, but distilled downward to the irreducible core. This is what comes back when the Raven Lord returns to real space. The intelligence about the traitor forces, the capability to engage them where they live, the knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years in their own nightmare, the operational capacity to pursue them past the point where the Imperium has ever been able to pursue them before. And underneath all of that, unchanged by 10,000 years of the worst the galaxy could do to it, the core that was there before the Primarch, before the Legion, before the war. The consciousness that was found in the darkness of Lycaeus and taught by people who had nothing to give except their knowledge and their solidarity, and that has never, across the entire length of this history, found a reason to revise its foundational assessment of what matters and what is worth fighting for. That is what the Shadow brings back. That is what the return of Corvus Corax changes. Not everything at once, not in the dramatic and visible way that Guilliman's return changed things, but in the particular quiet way that the Raven Lord always changed things. From the inside, from the dark, in ways that take a while to become visible, and that turn out, when they do become visible, to have been building for a very long time. The shadow passes, the Raven comes back, and when it does, the setting will never quite be the same. A final thought before the dark closes in. The story of Corvus Corax is, at its deepest level, a story about what endures when the worst happens. Not what should endure according to philosophy or theology, or the expectations of the beings involved. What actually endures when the physical is stripped away, and the comfortable narratives about who we are and what we are doing are challenged by circumstances that do not accommodate them, when grief is too large for any of the standard forms it is supposed to take, and the only available option is to keep going, because stopping is not really an option. What endures in Corax is the thing that was there before the Primarch, before the Raven Guard and the Great Crusade and the war and the betrayal and the disaster. The consciousness that was found in the darkness of Lycaeus before it had a name for what it was, taught by slaves who had nothing to give except their knowledge and their solidarity and their faith that the person they were protecting was worth protecting, that organized a revolution because the people around it deserved something better than what they had been given, and that has never, across 10,000 years of the worst the galaxy could do to it, found a reason to revise that fundamental assessment of what matters. That is what the Shadow brings back when it returns, not the Primarch of the Horus Heresy era, not the being who said nevermore and walked into the dark. Something that went through all of that and is still here, still choosing according to the same core purpose, still fighting the same fight it has always been fighting, from deeper in the dark and with tools nobody saw coming but that are, on examination, exactly what the story of the Raven Lord was always pointing toward. The Raven Guard have been right. The story was not over. The Nevermore was not the last word. The Raven Lord is coming back, and when he does, the darkness he brings with him is not the darkness of defeat or loss or absence. It is the darkness of someone who went into the deepest dark that existed and learned it and turned it into a weapon and is bringing it back in service of the same thing it has always served. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the constant grinding erosion of hope, that specific thing is worth quite a lot. Thank you for spending this time with the lore. If you made it to the end of this one, that means something real, and it is genuinely appreciated. Corvus Corax is a story that does something true about grief and endurance, and what survives when everything surrounding a purpose is stripped away, and I hope it has given you something worth thinking about. Please subscribe if you have not already. Drop a comment below telling me where you are in the world and what time it is there, and what you think about the Raven Lord and his potential return. Share this with someone who loves the lore and would appreciate spending time with it. And take care of yourselves out there. Until next time, the dark does not last forever. The Raven always comes back. Part 12. The Raven Guard in the Era Indomitus, carrying the Nevermore. To understand what the return of Corvus Corax means for the Raven Guard, specifically in the current era of the setting, it helps to understand in some detail what the chapter has been doing in the 10,000 years since their Primarch spoke his final word and walked away. Because the Raven Guard have not simply been waiting, they have been working. Quietly, as they always work, in the dark, without announcement, doing the specific kind of work that the Raven Guard has always done, and doing it with the same methodical patience and disciplined precision that Corax built into their culture from the very beginning. The chapter that exists in the 41st millennium is not the same size as the legion that fought at the Great Crusade and was nearly destroyed at Istvan V. The Codex Astartes that Robert Guillemot introduced after the heresy restructured all of the Space Marine legions into independent chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each, and the Raven Guard were no exception. The 19th Legion, already reduced by the drop site massacre and the complications of the Raptor program's aftermath, was divided into the Raven Guard chapter proper and a small number of successor chapters whose gene seed was stable enough to support their founding. The numbers that had once been counted in the tens of thousands became numbers counted in the hundreds, and the vast fleet that had carried the Raven Guard across the galaxy during the Crusade was reduced to the vessels appropriate to a chapter rather than a legion. What did not change was the fundamental character of the organization. The Raven Guard in the 41st millennium conduct their operations the same way the 19th Legion conducted operations during the Great Crusade, through the same systematic preparation and the same patient intelligence gathering and the same precisely targeted strikes that leave enemies unable to understand what is happening until it has already happened. The Shadowhawks still fly. The Whisper Cutters, or their modern equivalents, still deliver warriors in silence. The doctrine of striking at the organizational intelligence of an opposition rather than directly at its military strength is still the foundational principle around which everything else is organized. The chapter's relationship with the Primaris Space Marines, the new generation of warriors developed by Robert Guillemot and Belisarius Cawl over the centuries following the heresy and deployed in force during the Indomitus Crusade, has been complex in the way that most long-established chapters' relationship with the Primaris program has been complex. The Primaris warriors are physically superior to standard Astartes in most respects, and the Mark X Phobos armor in particular, designed specifically for stealth and infiltration operations, is well suited to the Raven Guard's doctrinal needs. Phobos armored Primaris Raven Guard represent an interesting development of the chapter's capabilities, bringing the newer generation's enhanced physical capabilities to the operational approach that Corax built. Whether Corax himself, if he returns, would recognize the warriors who bear his gene seed and carry his name in this augmented form is an interesting question the lore does not yet answer. The chapter's senior leadership in the current era has been grappling with questions about the chapter's future that have no easy answers. The scattering, in which Chapter Master Kaivan Shrike convened the chapter and ordered their strategic deployment across the Imperium, represents a recognition that the Raven Guard's particular capabilities are needed in many places simultaneously, that concentrating the chapter's strength in one theater, while the galaxy is as fractured and as threatened as it currently is, would be a waste of what the Raven Guard specifically can offer. It also represents a dispersal of the chapter's organizational coherence, which carries its own risks. A chapter scattered across the galaxy, with individual elements fighting in isolated theaters, is a chapter that cannot easily reconstitute itself if any of those elements encounter more than they can handle alone. There is something appropriate, in a very Raven Guard way, about the fact that their response to the current crisis is to disperse further into the dark, rather than to gather together and present a visible, unified force. It is the doctrine made literal. It is the institutional expression of Corax's fundamental principle that power is more effective when it is applied precisely and invisibly from multiple directions simultaneously than when it is concentrated and presented openly as a challenge to be met. But there is also something uncomfortable about it from the perspective of chapter identity and continuity. A chapter is held together by more than a shared doctrine. It is held together by the relationships between its members, by the shared experiences that create the specific bonds that make a group of extraordinary warriors into something more than a collection of extraordinary warriors, by the institutional memory that accumulates through shared service and shared loss and shared victory. When a chapter is scattered across a galaxy that has been split in half by a warp storm of unprecedented scale, maintaining that cohesion is not a trivial challenge. The appointment of Athon Shan as chapter master, following Kaivan Shrike's resignation, represents the beginning of whatever comes next for the Raven Guard in the current era. The specific nature of what that will be is not yet written, which is one of the reasons why the question of Corax's potential return is so significant for the chapter specifically. A Raven Guard facing the challenges of the era Indomitus with their Primarch absent is a very different organization from a Raven Guard facing those challenges with whatever Corax has become potentially available to them. Not because his presence would solve their structural challenges or answer their institutional questions about how to maintain coherence during the scattering, but because his presence would change the context in which all of those questions are being asked, would add a dimension to the chapter's understanding of itself and its capabilities that has been absent for 10,000 years. The gene seed instability that has always been the Raven Guard's most persistent biological challenge continues to be a factor in the current era, shaping how the chapter recruits and trains and promotes its warriors in ways that distinguish them from chapters with more stable gene seed. The longer induction process that the Raven Guard require, the additional time needed for the organs to integrate properly with the specific challenges that Corax's gene seed presents, means that replacement of losses is slower than in other chapters. This has shaped the Raven Guard's relationship with risk and casualty in specific ways, making them more conservative in how they commit their warriors to direct engagement and more reliant on the preparatory and intelligence-gathering work that can prevent direct engagement from becoming necessary at all. In a chapter where producing a new, fully capable warrior takes significantly longer than it does for most other organizations, the calculus around acceptable losses is different. The Sable Brand, the psychic condition affecting some Raven Guard warriors, continues to be managed through the trifold path of shadow in the current era, as it has been for centuries. The specific warriors who exhibit the condition most strongly are the most capable librarians and chaplains of the chapter, the individuals most deeply connected to its spiritual traditions, and managing their connection to the shadow aspect of their nature without allowing it to become consuming is an ongoing institutional challenge. The trifold path has been refined over generations and is now a sophisticated set of meditative and operational practices that the chapter's librarians and chaplains work with as a fundamental part of their service, but it remains a management framework, rather than a framework of full understanding, a set of tools for working with something that has not been fully understood, because its fullest expression has not been available for study. Corax's return would not simply inspire the Raven Guard, though inspiration is not a negligible thing in a setting where the psychological and spiritual dimension of a fighting force's capability is as significant as the physical dimension. It would provide the chapter with something it has never had in 10,000 years of operation, a direct line to the source. The actual being from whom everything they are is derived, available not as a historical record or a preserved document or a set of traditions passed down through generations, but as a present and engaged consciousness with direct knowledge of what their nature actually is and what it can become. Part 13. The broader setting: how Corax changes the war. The return of Corvus Corax would not only change the Raven Guard, it would change the shape of the conflict between the Imperium and the forces of chaos in the current era in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate, but that can be reasoned about from available evidence. Consider first the specific problem of the Eye of Terror as an operational theater. For 10,000 years, the Eye has functioned as a sanctuary for the traitor legions. They retreat there when they need to recover. They plan there without interference from loyalist intelligence. They develop new capabilities and new organizational structures and new approaches to the conflict against the Imperium in a space that loyalist forces cannot enter effectively and cannot monitor reliably. The Eye is their base of operations in the deepest and most fundamental sense, the space from which everything they do in the material universe ultimately originates. Corax has been inside that sanctuary for 10,000 years, not as a threat that the traitor legions have been able to neutralize, but as a persistent presence that they have been forced to operate around and to account for. His existence inside the Eye has already changed how the traitor forces operate in there, in ways that the material universe has no reliable intelligence about, but that must be significant. A predator in a sanctuary changes how the inhabitants of that sanctuary behave. It changes where they feel safe, what they are willing to do without defensive backup, how they organize their movements and their operations and their planning. 10,000 years of Corax's presence inside the Eye has shaped the traitor legions in ways that nobody in the material universe knows about. If he returns, and those effects become visible, if the intelligence he carries about what his presence has done to the traitor forces becomes available to Guilliman and the Lion and the rest of the loyalist leadership, the strategic picture of the conflict changes significantly. Not because the traitor legions have been defeated or diminished by Corax's hunting, they have not. They remain enormously powerful forces that continue to threaten the Imperium across multiple fronts simultaneously. But because information about how they have been shaped by 10,000 years of operating with a loyalist predator in their midst is information that changes how the Imperium can engage them. There is also the specific question of what Corax's return means for the Chaos God's own strategic planning. The ruinous powers operate on timescales and with levels of complexity that mortal minds cannot fully process, but they are not omniscient and they are not infinitely adaptable. They have operating frameworks, ways of thinking about the conflict with the Imperium that have been developed over 10,000 years of consistent patterns. Corax's existence inside the Eye has already introduced an anomaly into those frameworks, an element that does not fit the categories they have established for understanding what loyalist forces can and cannot do. His return to the material universe, his formal integration into the loyalist side's military strategy as an active and acknowledged element would require the Chaos Gods to update those frameworks in ways that take time and resources and attention. The Chaos Gods are not easily disrupted, but they are not undisruptible. The Great Rift itself was a surprise to the Imperium, a sudden, massive escalation that the Imperium had not fully anticipated and was not structurally prepared to handle. There is a certain poetic justice in the possibility that the Imperium's response to that escalation might include the return of a being whose very existence is a surprise to the Chaos Gods, a loyalist warp entity that their frameworks were not built to account for, operating in ways that their established playbooks do not cover. Beyond the strategic and operational dimensions, there is the psychological and symbolic dimension of Corax's return to consider. And in Warhammer 40,000, the psychological and symbolic dimensions of events are never purely secondary. The setting takes seriously the idea that belief and narrative, and the meaning that conscious beings assign to events, have real and measurable effects on how those events unfold. The Chaos Gods themselves are sustained by belief. The Emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne sustains the Astronomicon through the collective faith of billions of Psykers. The morale and the conviction of fighting forces in the setting has tangible effects on their combat effectiveness in ways that go beyond simply the psychological. A Corax who returns carries with him a specific symbolic weight that is distinct from, and in some ways more significant, than anything Guilliman or the Lion carried when they returned. Guilliman returning is the story of the great administrator and planner coming back to try to fix what broke while he was away. A story of competence and determination and the patient work of institutional reconstruction. The Lion returning is the story of the sleeping hero awakening when his sons need him most. A story of return and the resolution of ancient guilt. Both of these are powerful stories, but neither of them is the story that Corax carries. Corax returning is the story of something that went into the worst that the enemy could offer. Alone, without support, without recognition, without any prospect of reward or acknowledgement, and came back from it, having become something that the enemy cannot simply understand or counter or categorize. It is the story of what loyalty looks like when it is not witnessed and not rewarded and not comfortable. It is the story of what endures when everything is stripped away, and the answer to that story is that what endures is the thing that was there at the very beginning. The core purpose and the core identity that was formed in the tunnels of Lycaeus by a child who had been given nothing except chains and a name that meant deliverer. That story, told in the right context at the right moment, is the kind of story that changes how people think about what is possible. Not just for the Raven Guard, for the Imperium as a whole, for every human and every warrior who has been told by the darkness of the current era that the costs of continuing are too high, and the odds of success are too low, and the future is not going to be better than the present. A Corax who comes back from 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, changed beyond recognition, carrying the knowledge and the capability of what that transformation has produced, is a Corax who proves by his existence that the worst the darkness can do is not enough. That proof matters in a setting where the darkness has been winning for a very long time. Part 14. What form does the return take? Possibilities and consequences. The specific mechanics of how Corvus Corax might return to the material universe, and what form that return might take, are questions that the lore has not yet answered in any definitive way, but they are worth thinking through because the different possibilities carry very different implications. The simplest possibility is that Corax steps back through the boundary of the Eye of Terror into real space, arriving somewhere in the material universe in his current transformed state, and begins operating in the material universe the way he has been operating inside the Eye. This would mean a return that is sudden and perhaps locally visible, a manifestation of shadow and ravens, and the particular quality of darkness that has become his defining characteristic, arriving in some theater of the current conflict and doing what he does. This form of return would be immediately recognizable as significant to anyone with the knowledge to recognize it, which in the Raven Guard means essentially everyone, and in the broader Imperium means the senior inquisitorial and Astartes leadership who are familiar with the lore surrounding the missing Primarchs. But it would also be initially disorienting, because what arrives is not the Primarch anyone has seen depicted in historical records or in the artwork of the Raven Guard's chapels and traditions. It is something that looks nothing like a Primarch in any conventional sense, something that presents as shadow and darkness, and the particular presence that 10,000 years of transformation has produced, that would need to demonstrate both its identity and its continued loyalty before the people encountering it could effectively integrate it into their operational planning. A more gradual return is also possible, where Corax begins making contact with the Raven Guard, before fully committing to a presence in the material universe, where the chapter learns that their Primarch has been alive and operating inside the Eye before the formal return to real space occurs. This form would give both Corax and the Raven Guard time to develop the understanding needed to work together effectively across the enormous gap that 10,000 years of very different experiences have created between them. It would also give the Raven Guard time to process what his return means before they need to explain it to anyone else or integrate it into their operations in any formal way. A return coordinated with Guilliman's ongoing strategic work on the Indomitus Crusade is a third possibility, where Corax's return is not just a Raven Guard event, but a deliberate addition to the Loyalist side's military strategy where Guilliman and Corax work out how to deploy what Corax carries most effectively before the return is formalized. This would require some prior communication between the two Primarchs, which is not obviously impossible given Corax's warp-based capabilities, and it would produce a return that is strategically coherent from the beginning, rather than something that needs to be integrated after the fact. Whatever form the return takes, the consequences unfold across multiple dimensions simultaneously. For the Raven Guard, the consequences are primarily about identity and capability, about understanding themselves and their own nature more fully than they have been able to since their Primarch left. For the broader Imperium, the consequences are primarily about strategic capability, about what the Loyalist side can now do that it could not do before Corax returned. For the traitor forces inside the Eye, the consequences are about the formalization of a threat that has been implicit for 10,000 years, the acknowledgement that the hunting has not stopped and will now extend into the material universe as well. For the Chaos Gods, the consequences are about the introduction of a genuine anomaly into a conflict that had settled into relatively predictable patterns, the necessity of updating frameworks that have worked for 10,000 years to accommodate something they were not built to accommodate. The most interesting consequences, the ones that the setting will be grappling with in narrative terms for years of real-world time after the return is formalized, are the interpersonal ones. What does Corax say to the Raven Guard? Not in the formal tactical briefing sense, but in the human sense, in the sense that the chapter has been carrying his absence as a defining characteristic for 10,000 years, and has very specific and very complex feelings about what that absence has meant. What does he say to Guilliman, who is his brother, in the sense that both of them were made by the same father for the same purpose, but who is otherwise a very different kind of being, with a very different approach to the crisis they are both trying to address? What does he say to Lion L. Johnson, who he knew as a rival and occasional ally during the Great Crusade, and who has returned from his own 10,000-year absence in a very different way and for very different reasons? And what does he think of what the Imperium has become in his absence? One of the defining narrative threads of Guilliman's return has been his horror at what the Imperium has become in 10,000 years, without the guidance of the beings who built it. The institutionalized cruelty and the bureaucratic corruption and the religious fanaticism that has calcified around the Emperor's memory in ways that bear little resemblance to what the Emperor actually wanted or valued. Guilliman has been working to address some of these things, with very limited success, given the scale and the entrenched nature of what he is trying to change. Corax was always the Primarch most fundamentally committed to the dignity and freedom of ordinary people. He grew up among the most oppressed people imaginable, and built his entire worldview and his entire military philosophy around the principle that power should be used to free people rather than to bind them. What he finds when he returns to the Imperium, an institution that has spent 10,000 years becoming more rather than less authoritarian, more rather than less cruel, more rather than less indifferent to the lives of the ordinary people it claims to protect, is a question that the setting would need to address with some seriousness if it addresses his return at all. Guilliman's response to the Imperium's evolution has been to work within it while trying to reform its worst tendencies. The Lion's response has been to focus on the specific issue closest to him, the Dark Angels and the Fallen, and to engage with the broader Imperium primarily through that lens. Corax's response might be something different from either of those. Given his specific history and his specific values and the 10,000 years of hunting for the Imperium in the dark, while the Imperium itself was evolving in directions he would likely find uncomfortable. Part 15. The Eternal Question. Is the story over or just beginning? Throughout the history of Warhammer 40,000 as a setting, one of the most recurring and most powerful narrative questions has been whether the darkness wins in the end. Whether the grimdark future the setting is famous for is a description of a trajectory, a direction of travel that cannot be altered regardless of what any individual or any faction does, or whether it is a description of a current state from which things could potentially get better, or at least differently worse, if the right actions are taken at the right moments. The setting has always resisted giving a clean answer to this question, and for good reason. A setting where the darkness definitively wins has no space for the kind of heroism that makes the stories meaningful. A setting where the darkness is ultimately overcome through sufficient heroism has no real grimdark, no weight to the darkness that makes the heroism matter. The best version of the setting holds both of these in tension, acknowledges both of them as real forces without fully resolving the tension between them. Corvus Corax's story is one of the places in the lore where this tension is most clearly visible and most clearly handled. His departure into the Eye of Terror could be read as the setting's darkness winning. A great loyalist commander, someone who had dedicated his entire existence to fighting for the Imperium and for the people it protected, broken by the specific cruelty of the heresy and the specific failure of the Raptor program and the specific accumulation of losses that the Horus heresy represented, walking away into the dark and not coming back. That is a story about what happens when the darkness is too much for even the most capable and the most dedicated to resist. That is a very grimdark story. But the evidence of what has happened inside the Eye of Terror, the evidence that Corax is alive and transformed and still loyal and still fighting and still defined by the core purpose that he has always been defined by, tells a different story. It tells the story of what happens when the darkness takes the worst it can and applies it to the fullest possible extent and still cannot manage to break what it is trying to break, still cannot corrupt what it is trying to corrupt, still cannot redirect what it is trying to redirect toward its own purposes. The darkness spent 10,000 years trying to do something to Corvus Corax, and what it actually produced is Corvus Corax more completely and more fully himself than he has ever been. That is not the darkness winning. That is something more complicated and more interesting than the darkness winning. The Raven Guard's 10,000 years of maintaining the chapter in the absence of their Primarch is the same story told at a smaller scale. They have been carrying an absence that they cannot fully explain and cannot fully resolve, continuing to do the work that the chapter was built to do, in the faith that the work matters even when the being who taught them to value it is not there to see it done. That faith could be read as pathetic, as the continuation of a practice long after its foundation has been removed, as an institution going through motions because it does not know how to stop. Or it could be read as the most authentic form of loyalty, the kind that does not require the presence of the person being loyal to in order to remain real and operational, the kind that holds its form not because of external pressure or expectation, but because the values it is built around are genuinely held rather than simply professed. The Raven Guard have been genuinely holding those values for 10,000 years. The care for minimum necessary collateral harm, the preference for precision over overwhelming force, the understanding that the most effective military action is the one that the enemy never sees coming and never understands until after it has already worked. The grim patience and the disciplined stillness that Corax built into the chapter's culture from its very founding. These have not been maintained because someone was watching to make sure they were maintained. They have been maintained because the Raven Guard genuinely believe in them, because the values became the chapter's own rather than remaining properties borrowed from their Primarch. That is what loyalty looks like when it is real rather than performed. And that is what the Raven Guard's 10,000 years of continuing to be themselves while their Primarch was absent demonstrates about who they are. When Corax comes back, when the shadow finally returns from the eye of the storm and steps back into the light that has been maintained in his absence, the meeting between what he has become and what they have kept alive will be one of the most significant moments in the setting's history. Not because it resolves anything simply or comfortably, not because the return wipes away the grief of the departure or makes the losses of the heresy retroactively worth the cost, which is not how any of this works and has never been how any of this works, but because it completes a story that has been building for 10,000 years and establishes a new one that has been implicit in everything the setting has been doing with the missing Primarchs, ever since the question of where they went and what happened to them began to receive actual, in-universe answers. The nevermore is not the last word. The story is not over. And that is worth knowing. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and the light of the Astronomicon has been dimmed by a wound in the galaxy that may or may not be healable, and where every victory is temporary, and every respite is brief, and the darkness presses in from every direction simultaneously. It is worth knowing that the darkness sent someone into the worst of itself and could not keep them. It is worth knowing that the Raven always comes back. Part 16. the weight of names, Corvus, Corax, and the language of identity. There is something worth paying attention to in the names themselves. The name Corvus Corax is not accidental. In Latin, Corvus means raven. In ancient Greek, Corax also means raven, the binomial scientific name for the common raven, the bird that appears on the raven guard's heraldry, and that manifests as the spectral flocks that are a defining feature of Corax's transformed state, is Corvus Corax. The Primarch's name translates, essentially, as Raven Raven, or Raven Heart, if you read the Latin more liberally. He is named twice for the same thing, as if whoever gave him his name wanted to make sure the association was impossible to miss or to misread. His final word before departing into the Eye of Terror, nevermore, is a direct reference to Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem about a raven, a bird that can only speak that single word and that answers every desperate question about the possibility of future peace or reunion or relief with the same absolute negation. The raven in the poem does not speak from cruelty. It speaks because it knows only the one word, and the one word happens to be the only honest answer to every question the grieving man is asking of it. Nevermore. You will not see your lost love again. Nevermore. The grief will not lift. Nevermore. There is no relief coming, no restoration, no future without the weight of this loss. Corax, who grew up on a moon called Lycaeus and renamed it Deliverance and named his legion the Raven Guard, and whose defining psychic ability was a connection to shadow and darkness that eventually grew to encompass his entire being, chose that specific word at the moment of his departure. He was not simply quoting a poem because he knew it was appropriate. He was saying something specific and intentional about his state of mind, about the relationship between the man he had been and the Primarch the galaxy had made him, about what he believed was possible going forward. He did not believe the grief would lift. He did not believe the losses could be made right. He did not believe that staying and continuing to work within the structures of the Imperium would produce the thing he needed. All of that was gone. Nevermore. But here is the thing about the raven in Poe's poem. The raven is not the source of the grief. The man was grieving before the raven arrived. And the raven merely confirms what the man already suspects, that the loss is permanent, and that the answers he is hoping for are not coming. The raven is not the darkness. The raven is the thing that tells the truth about the darkness in the only language it has. Corvus Corax was always the raven in this sense. He was always the thing that told the truth about the darkness, the being that understood it and moved through it and used it, rather than being frightened of it. And what the Eye of Terror did to him was not change this fundamental characteristic. It amplified it. It developed it. It allowed it to become fully what it had always been reaching toward being. A raven that has been in the darkness long enough eventually becomes the darkness. But the raven is still there inside it. The raven always comes back. The name Deliverer, the name the slaves of Lycaeus gave to the child they found and hid and taught, is the counterpoint to Nevermore. Nevermore is the word of ending, the word that acknowledges that certain things are over and cannot be recovered. Deliverer is the word of possibility, the word that projects forward from a present of suffering toward a future that is not yet real, but might become real if the right action is taken at the right moment. The name was given to a child who had no demonstrated capacity yet to deliver anyone from anything, given in faith that what was true of the child's nature would eventually express itself in actions that justified the name. Corax has been the deliverer and the Nevermore simultaneously his entire existence. The man who freed the slaves of Lycaeus, who brought world after world into compliance with the Imperium through methods that minimized civilian harm, who tried to rebuild his legion after Istvan V and grant his wounded warriors the dignity of a meaningful death when the rebuild went wrong, who went into the Eye of Terror not to abandon his purpose, but to pursue it in the only remaining form available to him, has been both things at once throughout, the ending and the beginning, the closing of what cannot be recovered and the opening of what might yet become real. His return would be both things simultaneously. The acknowledgement that 10,000 years have passed and that everything that happened in them was real and cannot be undone. And the opening of what comes next, which is a new chapter in a story that the Nevermore was not able to end. Ravens return. That is what they do. They go out into the dark and they come back with what they find there. The common raven, the actual bird whose scientific name Corax carries as his own, is one of the most cognitively sophisticated birds on Terra. It has memory that extends across years. It recognizes individuals and maintains relationships. It uses tools. It plans for the future in ways that most animals do not. It goes away, and it comes back. It takes what it found in the dark and brings it back to the place it left from. Corvus Corax, the man named twice for the raven, has been out in the dark for 10,000 years. He is coming back. He will bring with him what he found there. And the setting will be dealing with the implications of what he brings for a very long time. Part 17. The broader pattern. What the missing Primarchs mean for the setting's future. The return of Corvus Corax cannot be separated from the question of what is happening with the other missing Loyalist Primarchs, because the evidence of what happened to Corax in the Eye of Terror implies a pattern that, if it holds, changes the strategic situation of the 41st millennium in ways that go far beyond any single Primarch's individual contribution. The setting currently has 2 confirmed returned Loyalist Primarchs, Robut Guillemon, who returned during the Gathering Storm period and has been conducting the Indomitus Crusade since then, and Lion L. Johnson, who returned during the Arcs of Omen campaign and has been dealing with the Dark Angel situation since then. Both of these returns were significant events in the setting's narrative. Both changed the immediate strategic situation in their respective areas of influence, and both created ongoing narrative threads that the setting continues to develop. But 2 returns is not yet a pattern. 2 data points is a coincidence or a beginning. What makes it a pattern is the evidence that the mechanism of return is operating more broadly, that the forces which are bringing Guillemon and the Lion back to active involvement in the conflict are operating on the other missing Primarchs as well, and that the specific form their return takes when it occurs is not simply revival, but transformation in the way that Corax's ongoing presence in the Eye suggests. If Corax returns in something approaching his current transformed state, that is the 3rd data point. 3 data points is a trend of Primarchs returning in forms that have been developed and refined by whatever specific experience they went through during their absence, forms that are more completely themselves than they were when they left, forms that address specific needs in the current conflict that no conventional force could address, is a trend that has enormous implications for where the narrative is going. Leman Russ, if he returns from the Eye of Terror with 10,000 years of the same developmental process that produced what Corax has become, brings something specific to the conflict. Jagatai Khan, if he returns from the Webway with whatever the Webway has done with his fundamental characteristics, brings something specific. Vulcan, as a perpetual, exists in a different relationship to time and development, but is equally certain to have been changed by 10,000 years of continued experience and deliberate development. Each missing Primarch, if and when they return, brings the specific version of their essential characteristics that a very long time, in a very demanding environment, has produced. The Chaos Gods and the Traitor Forces have been planning and operating around the assumption that the missing Loyalist Primarchs are simply absent, that the Loyalist side of the conflict has been permanently diminished by their disappearance. If that assumption is incorrect, if the missing Primarchs are in the process of becoming rather than simply being absent, the strategic implications are very large indeed. The Chaos Gods have spent 10,000 years building toward an endgame in a game where some of the most significant pieces on the opposing side were not actually off the board, they were in development. This does not mean the Loyalist side wins. Warhammer 40,000 is not a setting where the forces of light triumph cleanly over the forces of darkness, and any return of Primarchs will come with costs and complications and the kinds of difficult moral and practical problems that the setting always presents when it is working at its best. But it does mean that the shape of the conflict is different from what it has appeared to be for 10,000 years. It means the darkness did not accomplish everything it thought it accomplished when it scattered the Primarchs and then triggered the heresy that cost so many of them so much. The Emperor, whose perspective on events the setting has always suggested, operates on timescales and with complexities that mortal understanding cannot fully grasp, may have known this, may have built it into the design of his sons, the capacity for this kind of development as a contingency against exactly the kind of catastrophe that the heresy represented. The Golden Throne and the Emperor's continuing existence in some attenuated form, the Astronomicon and the psychic network it maintains, the possibility that the Emperor himself is doing something on a scale and time scale that will only become apparent when it is complete, all of these are threads in the setting's theology that remain genuinely unresolved and that connect in interesting ways to the question of what the Primarchs are and what they are becoming. Whether or not the Emperor designed this as a contingency, the pattern that is becoming visible as the missing Primarchs begin to return suggests that the darkness took its worst shot at the Emperor's sons and did not succeed in taking them out of the game. It changed them. It transformed them in ways that nobody anticipated and that the forces of chaos are not prepared for. But it did not break them. It did not corrupt them. It did not claim them. That is, in the context of this setting and what it is about, a very significant thing to have established. Part 18. For the Raven Guard, specifically what they will tell their initiates. When the Raven Guard eventually tell the story of Corvus Corax's return to their initiates, the new warriors who are learning for the first time the history of the chapter and the Primarch who shaped everything about who they are, the story will be different from the story they have been telling for 10,000 years. Not because the facts of what happened during and after the heresy have changed. Those facts are fixed and will remain fixed, but because the ending, or rather the continuation, of the story is different. For 10,000 years, the story that Raven Guard initiates learned about their Primarch ended with a word and an absence. Corax organized and led, and fought, and failed, and grieved, and attempted recovery, and watched that recovery become something monstrous, and organized the successors, and finally said nevermore, and walked into the dark, and did not come back. That was the story, and the lesson drawn from it, or the lesson that the chapter wanted initiates to draw from it, was about the importance of maintaining the doctrine and the values even when the person who created them is absent, about carrying the heritage forward even through loss, about being the Raven Guard, regardless of whether the Raven Lord is present to observe it. That lesson remains valid. It was true before Corax returned, and it will be true after he returns, because the lesson is about the intrinsic value of what the Raven Guard are, rather than about the contingent fact of whether their Primarch is present. Values that only hold when the person who established them is watching are not really values. They are performance. The Raven Guard's 10,000 years of being genuinely themselves in Corax's absence is the demonstration that their values are real. But the story that initiates learn after the return is longer, and the longer story has a different shape. The word is still in it. The absence is still in it. The grief and the failed Raptor program and the specific weight of everything that drove Corax into the Eye in the first place are all still in the story. But the story continues past the departure. It goes into the Eye with him, follows him through 10,000 years of becoming something unprecedented, emerges into the evidence of what he became through the encounter with Lorgar, and then continues to whatever form the return actually takes. That longer story is a story about what loyalty actually means when it is taken to its limit. Not the comfortable version of loyalty, the version that is sustained by community and recognition, and the knowledge that the person you are loyal to is aware of and values your loyalty. The other version, the version that has to sustain itself across 10,000 years in the dark, with no audience and no recognition and no prospect of reward, doing the work because the work matters, and because the alternative is not doing it, and the alternative is not acceptable. That version of loyalty is the version that the Raven Guard have been modeling for 10,000 years by continuing to be the Raven Guard. And Corax's return, if it comes, is the version that Corax has been modeling inside the Eye for 10,000 years by continuing to be Corvus Corax despite everything the Eye tried to make him into. The initiates who learn this story will learn something more complex and more true than the story that ended with Nevermore. They will learn that the darkness is real, and that its costs are real, and that the losses are real, and that the grief is real, and that all of these things are permanent in the sense that what happened cannot be made not to have happened. And they will learn that none of those real and permanent things were enough to end the story, that the story continued past the worst of what the darkness could do, that the being who was found in the tunnels of Lycaeus and given a name that meant deliverer still exists 10,000 years later, still choosing according to the same fundamental values, still fighting the same fundamental fight, in a form that nothing that tried to stop him managed to stop. That is the story the Raven Guard will eventually tell. It is a harder story than the one they have been telling, and a better one. Part 19. The Lorgar Problem. Why the Wordbearers Fear the Dark. There is a thread in the lore of the Horus Heresy and the 41st Millennium that does not get enough attention, which is the specific and documented fear that Lorgar Aurelian has carried regarding Corvus Corax, not just since the events of the heresy, but since before the heresy formally began. Understanding this fear in detail, understanding where it comes from and what it is based on, and why it has persisted through 10,000 years, and the elevation of Lorgar to Daemon Prince status, provides important insight into what Corax has actually become, and what his return would mean for the traitor Primarchs specifically. Before the heresy began, during the period in which Lorgar was conducting his great pilgrimage through the Eye of Terror, learning the nature of the Chaos Gods and establishing the theological basis for the rebellion he was preparing, he was guided through parts of the Eye by demonic entities whose knowledge of the space exceeded his own. One of those entities told him specifically that if he ever fought Corax in earnest, the outcome would be his death. Not a near thing, not a possibility to be managed with sufficient caution. Death. This was not a prediction about the past or the present, but about the future, about what would happen if a specific encounter occurred. And it was a prediction delivered by an entity with sufficient knowledge of both Lorgar and Corax to make a confident projection about their hypothetical combat. Daemon entities in the Eye of Terror with that kind of knowledge do not make such statements casually or imprecisely. They make them because they understand something true about the relationship between the specific beings involved. What did the entity know about Corax that produced this prediction? The most likely answer is that it understood what Corax's fundamental nature was, and what that nature would eventually become, given sufficient development, whether in the Eye of Terror or anywhere else with sufficient exposure to the warp's energies. The daemonic entity could read the potential encoded in Corax's psychic nature, could see what the Shadow Walk was reaching toward, could understand that a being with that specific fundamental characteristic, given sufficient time and sufficient development, would become something that the specific vulnerabilities in Lorgar's nature made him unable to overcome. Lorgar's fundamental characteristic is faith, the capacity for absolute devotion to a cause or a being or a set of principles, expressed through the application of every resource available to him in service of that devotion. His power as a Daemon Prince of Chaos Undivided comes from this characteristic, amplified and expanded, and connected to the ruinous powers through 10,000 years of service. His strength is the strength of conviction, backed by divine sponsorship. His weakness, if he has one, is the corollary of this strength, the specific vulnerabilities that come with being a being whose power is channeled through connection to the Chaos Gods. Corax's fundamental characteristic is the Shadow Walk, the connection to darkness and shadow that allows him to be effectively invisible to perception and to strike from positions his enemies cannot defend against. His strength, in his current form, is the strength of something that cannot be seen coming, that moves through the warp's own substance, without the limitations that warp-native entities work around, because they belong to the powers that govern that substance. His power does not come from connection to any patron. It does not flow through any framework that the Chaos Gods can reach into and manipulate or withdraw. A being whose strength is absolute faith in divine power, meeting a being that is immune to the specific mechanisms through which divine power operates in the warp and that can strike from positions the faith-based defenses cannot reach, is a being at a specific structural disadvantage, not an absolute disadvantage. Lorgar is immensely powerful, and his connection to the Chaos Gods gives him access to resources that Corax cannot match in terms of raw divine energy. But the specific way in which Lorgar's power is organized, and the specific way in which Corax's capabilities are organized, create a matchup that, as the daemonic entity correctly identified, tends toward a specific outcome. The near-death at Istvan V, where Corax came close enough to ending Lorgar that only Conrad Kurz's physical intervention prevented it, happened when Corax was a wounded Primarch, operating under extreme duress in the worst circumstances the heresy had yet produced for the loyalist side. Lorgar had the advantages of the betrayal, of fighting in a prepared position, of having traitor legions available for support, and Corax nearly killed him anyway. What does the encounter in the Eye of Terror represent, decades of development later, with Corax having spent 10,000 years becoming what he has become and operating on ground that Lorgar has been comfortable considering his own? It represents a matchup that the demonic entity's prediction covers. It represents Lorgar calling for help and retreating not because he is cowardly, but because the alternative, standing and fighting the thing that has come to fight him, is not an outcome he can accept the risk of. This matters for the question of what Corax's return means, because it establishes, through the most reliable possible source of information about relative capabilities on the traitor side, that what Corax has become is genuinely capable of addressing the traitor Primarchs in a way that nothing on the Loyalist side currently can. The other Loyalist Primarchs are formidable. Guilliman is among the most capable military strategists in the setting's history. The Lion is one of the most powerful individual combatants among the Loyalist forces. Neither of them is positioned to engage Lorgar or any other traitor Daemon Primarch in the warp and threaten to permanently end them. Corax is. The Wordbearers as a legion have been shaped by their Primarch's specific fear in ways that are worth noting. A legion whose Primarch has spent 10,000 years in extended seclusion, withdrawn from the kind of active campaigning that other traitor legions continue to pursue, is a legion that has had different formative experiences in the current era than the legions whose Primarchs remained actively engaged. The Wordbearers are still functional and still dangerous and still one of the significant forces available to Chaos in the conflict against the Imperium. But they have been developing in a specific direction shaped by Lorgar's priorities, which have been shaped by Lorgar's fear, which has been shaped by his awareness of Corvus Corax. In a setting where the psychological and spiritual dimensions of events have tangible effects on how those events unfold, the fact that one of the most significant traitor legions has been shaped by its Primarch's fear of a Loyalist warp entity is not a minor detail. It is a thread that, pulled at the right moment, may affect how the Wordbearers respond to events in ways that benefit the Loyalist side. Fear is not just an emotional state. In this setting, in this conflict, it is information about the structure of reality, about who is actually more capable than who, in the specific ways that matter, in the specific encounters that will determine the outcome of specific confrontations. Lorgar is afraid of Corax. The Wordbearers, at some level, know this, even if they do not fully understand it. When Corax returns to the material universe, and that fact becomes known in the setting, the Wordbearers' response to that knowledge will be shaped by 10,000 years of operating in the shadow of their Primarch's documented fear of a specific being. That is a psychological and institutional burden that does not simply dissolve when the being it is founded in finally arrives. If anything, it intensifies. Part 20. Closing the Circle Deliverance waits for its deliverer. There is a specific poignancy in the fact that Corax grew up on a moon that the people he liberated renamed Deliverance, and that the fortress monastery of the Raven Guard on that moon is called the Raven Spire, and that the Raven Guard have been operating out of both for 10,000 years, in the absence of the being who gave those names their meaning. Deliverance. The word carries the whole arc of Corax's story in miniature. The slaves of Lycaeus renamed their moon because Corax had delivered them from the system that had bound them, had done the specific and costly thing that was required to free them from the specific mechanism of their oppression. They gave the name to the place because they wanted the fact of what happened there to be permanently encoded in how the place was identified, wanted the liberation to be the defining characteristic of the location, rather than its previous history as a prison and a mine. The Raven Guard have been on Deliverance for 10,000 years. They have been operating out of a place named for the act that their Primarch performed before they were their Primarch's legion, before the Emperor came to find his lost son and appointed him to command. The name preceded the legion. The name was given by the people Corax fought for before the Imperial project of the Great Crusade gave him a different, larger scale of people to fight for. If Corax returns and returns to Deliverance, he returns to a place that was named for him by the people whose liberation was the first expression of who he was. He returns to a fortress built from the converted ruins of the Overseer's Tower, the symbol of oppression turned into the house of those who overcame it. He returns to a chapter that has been maintaining the practices and the culture he developed for 10,000 years, in a place that carries his story in its very name. There is a closing of a circle in that specific return, a coming back to the place that defined what he was before the Imperium, gave him a legion and a role and a place in the grand project. A return not just to the Raven Guard, but to deliverance, to the starting point, to the name that the people of Lycaeus gave him before he was the Raven Lord, or the Shadowed Lord, or the Primarch of the 19th Legion, or any of the other names that history has accumulated around him. Before all of those names, he was the Deliverer, the child found in the dark by people who had nothing to give him except their knowledge and their solidarity and their faith that he was worth protecting. The person who organized a revolution because the people around him deserved better than what they had been given. The being who made the hard calculation on Lycaeus and took responsibility for what that calculation cost and lived with it, because being responsible for the cost is part of what it means to actually be responsible for people rather than simply to claim responsibility for them. That is who returns when the Raven Lord comes back. Not just the 10,000-year warp entity that Lorgar is afraid of. Not just the intelligence asset that could change the Imperium's understanding of the traitor forces inside the Eye. Not just the operational capability that could pursue Daemon Primarchs into the space where conventional loyalist forces cannot follow them. All of those things are real, and they matter enormously for the practical question of how the return changes the conflict. But underneath all of them, unchanged by 10,000 years of transformation, is the Deliverer. The consciousness that was given that name before it had a name for itself, before it understood what it was, or what it would become, or what the galaxy was going to do to it in the long years after Lycaeus. The galaxy did its worst. The Eye of Terror did its worst. The Chaos Gods did whatever the Chaos Gods do to things that spend 10,000 years inside their domain without serving them. And what emerged is still the Deliverer, changed beyond recognition in form, unchanged in the thing that matters. The Raven Lord is coming back to deliverance, and when he does, the word his moon is named for will have a second meaning layered onto the first. Not just the liberation of the slaves of Lycaeus, the act that gave the moon its name, but the return of the being who performed that liberation, from the darkness he walked into, carrying the grief and the purpose that had nowhere else to go, carrying 10,000 years of what the darkness made of him, bringing it all back to the place where the story started. The Raven always comes back. It goes out into the dark, and it comes back with what it found there. And what Corvus Corax found in the dark of the Eye of Terror, what 10,000 years of hunting through the nightmare made of the grieving Primarch, who walked in with nothing left but his purpose, is something that the setting in the Raven Guard and the broader Imperium are not yet prepared for. But they will be. Because the story is not over. The nevermore was never the last word. It was the word before the long silence, before the return. And the return is coming. Deliverance waits for its deliverer. Part 21. The doctrine lives on Raven Guard in the Age of the Rift. One of the most quietly remarkable things about the Raven Guard in the era Indomitus is how thoroughly Corax's foundational doctrine has survived and adapted across 10,000 years of changing circumstances. The specific tactical tools have evolved. The specific equipment has been updated and augmented. The organizational structure has shifted with the requirements of the Codex and the challenges of the current era. But the core principles, the things Corax developed from first principles in the tunnels of Lycaeus and then refined across decades of the Great Crusade, remain recognizable in everything the Raven Guard do. The primacy of intelligence preparation before engagement has not changed. The Raven Guard still sends scouts and infiltrators ahead of their main force as a matter of standard operating procedure, still invest in knowing more about the terrain and the enemy and the objective before committing to action, still consider a poorly prepared engagement to be a failure of process, regardless of whether the engagement itself is ultimately successful. The doctrine of striking at organizational intelligence rather than at military strength directly has not changed. The preference for approaches that minimize collateral harm to civilian populations has not changed, though the definition of what constitutes the relevant civilian population has evolved with the era. What has changed is the scale and the complexity of the environment the Raven Guard are operating in. The Great Crusade, for all its violence and its scope, was fundamentally an expansion campaign, a project of bringing human worlds under a single political structure. The Era Indomitus is a crisis campaign, a project of trying to prevent the collapse of a structure that has already been partially destroyed and that continues to face threats from every direction simultaneously. The same doctrinal principles apply, but the application is more complex. The judgment calls are harder. The resources available relative to the scale of the challenges are smaller. The introduction of Primaris Space Marines to the Raven Guard has been managed with the practical pragmatism that the chapter has always brought to challenges. Assess what the new capability offers, integrate it where it adds genuine value, maintain the doctrinal coherence that makes the Raven Guard what they are, rather than simply acquiring capabilities that do not fit the framework. The Phobos Armored Primaris Marines, with their specifically designed infiltration and stealth capabilities, are a natural fit for the Raven Guard's operational approach. The Incursor and Infiltrator squads have become significant elements of Raven Guard operations in the current era, their enhanced capabilities in the reconnaissance and precision strike roles that define Raven Guard doctrine, making them genuinely valuable additions. The Invictor Tactical Warsuit, a new variant of Space Marine Walker deployed by the Raven Guard, among others, is worth mentioning, specifically because it represents an interesting development of the doctrinal principle of combining significant firepower with stealth capability. The Invictor is designed for close fire support, but with a focus on rapid deployment and operating in terrain that heavier walkers cannot access, which fits the Raven Guard's tactical approach in ways that more conventional heavy support options do not. Shadow Captain Kayvon Shrike, who served as chapter master before the scattering and whose history is closely associated with the current era of the Raven Guard, represents a specific type of warrior that the Raven Guard's doctrine produces. An elite operative whose capabilities in individual combat and independent operation are exceptional even by Space Marine standards, who combines personal combat skill with the tactical intelligence and doctrinal discipline of the chapter's approach to warfare. His subsequent resignation from the chapter master role and appointment of Athon Shan as his successor represents an interesting moment in the chapter's institutional evolution, a choice by a senior warrior to move from institutional leadership toward operational capability, which has a very Raven Guard quality to it. The scattering that Shrike ordered before stepping down, the deliberate dispersal of the chapter across the Imperium in response to the scale and distribution of threats in the current era, is the chapter's institutional expression of a doctrinal principle at the strategic scale. Small, independent, highly capable elements operating across a wide theater, each applying the Raven Guard's specific capabilities to specific local situations, collectively covering more ground and addressing more threats than a concentrated chapter could while operating from a single base. This is, in essence, the Raven Guard's approach to warfare scaled up to the level of chapter deployment strategy. It carries risks. A chapter dispersed in this way is more vulnerable than a concentrated chapter to the specific elements of those individual theater situations becoming more than an independent element can handle. It is harder to concentrate force when needed because the force is spread across too wide an area. Communication and coordination across the dispersal becomes a challenge when the Great Rift has disrupted many of the standard communication channels. But the Raven Guard have always operated in conditions where concentration is not an available option, and where the specific advantages of dispersed independent operation outweigh the risks, and their doctrine is built for exactly this kind of situation. When Corax returns, if Corax returns, the scattering will not automatically reverse or reconstitute itself. The Raven Guard elements deployed across the Imperium are already engaged in their respective theaters, already committed to the specific situations that brought them there, already building the specific operational understanding of their local terrain and enemy that the Raven Guard's doctrine requires before decisive action. But the return of the Primarch would change the frame within which all of those dispersed elements are operating, would provide a specific kind of strategic coherence to the scattering that the scattering currently lacks. Not because Corax would take direct command of all dispersed elements, which is not how the Raven Guard operate and is not consistent with either Corax's specific approach to command or the tactical reality of elements scattered across a galaxy-sized theater, but because his return would provide a specific orienting point, a specific fact about the situation that all elements could incorporate into their local decisions, that would make the scattering something more than individual elements doing their individual best in isolation. The Raven Lord's presence, even if diffuse and not physically co-located with any specific element, would be felt across the scattering. Because the Raven Guard have always operated best when the principles rather than the presence of their leader are what guides their decisions, and the return of the person who created those principles to active engagement with the conflict would sharpen and clarify those principles in ways that 10,000 years of institutional transmission has inevitably blurred. Part 22. The Unanswered Questions and Why They Matter. Any honest treatment of Corvus Corax's story in the current era has to acknowledge that there are significant questions about his situation that the lore has not yet answered and that cannot be answered from available information, without moving into speculation that goes beyond what the evidence supports. The most fundamental of these is the question of whether his transformation has cost him anything essential. The lore presents the transformation as the revelation of what was always there beneath the surface, the warp-formed consciousness stripped of the mortal facade, and frames this as a development rather than a loss. But development always comes with change, and change always involves the loss of some things as others are gained. The specific question of what Corax lost in 10,000 years of becoming what he has become is one that the lore has not yet answered in any detail. He may have lost the capacity for certain kinds of relationships. The specific bonds of brotherhood that he shared with his warriors during the Great Crusade and the Heresy, the personal connections that made the losses at Isstvan V so devastating in the specific human sense rather than simply in the strategic sense, may not be available to the entity he has become in the same form they were available to the Primarch he was. The transformation that made him capable of operating in the warp as a native entity may have changed the way he experiences connection and loss, and the specific texture of loyalty in ways that would make him different from the being his sons remember. Even if the core purpose is unchanged, the question of how he communicates is also not resolved. The being described in the lore is a humanoid entity of blades and living shadow, an entity that can manifest as a flock of ravens or dissolve into pure darkness. Whether this entity can speak in the conventional sense, can engage in the kind of sustained verbal exchange that would be necessary to convey 10,000 years of accumulated intelligence to Guilliman or to address the Raven Guard in any meaningful way, is not obvious from the description of his current form. Communication may need to take different forms, may need to be mediated through different channels, may require the people he is communicating with to develop new frameworks for receiving information from a source that does not present itself in the standard ways. There is also the question of what Corax wants. 10,000 years of hunting the traitors in the Eye of Terror has been the expression of a specific purpose, a purpose that was formed in grief and in the specific desire for something that could not be described as justice in any comfortable sense, but that served a similar psychological function. If and when that purpose reaches some kind of completion, if the specific traitors Corax went into the Eye to hunt are no longer available to be hunted, what then occupies a consciousness that has been organized around that specific purpose for 10,000 years? The answer the lore suggests, through the framing of his transformation as the revelation of his essential nature rather than the corruption of it, is that Corax is still fundamentally what he was before the departure, a being whose essential characteristic is the identification and exploitation of weaknesses in systems of oppression, operating in the dark, in service of the principle that people deserve better than what the worst actors in any system are willing to give them. The specific application of that essential characteristic has been the hunting of traitor primarchs through the Eye of Terror. If that specific application ends or changes, the essential characteristic does not go away with it. It finds new application. What that new application looks like in the material universe, if Corax returns and engages with the current era of the conflict, rather than continuing to operate exclusively within the Eye, is one of the most genuinely open questions in the setting. Not because the answer is arbitrary or unknowable, but because the answer depends on specific narrative decisions that have not yet been made, on what Games Workshop and Black Library Choose to do with a character whose current form gives them enormous narrative flexibility and whose history gives any choice they make significant weight. The potential is there for Corax's return to be one of the most narratively significant events in the setting's current era, as significant in its own way as Guilliman's return was and as the Lion's return was, but different from both, in the specific ways it affects the conflict and in the specific dimensions of the setting it illuminates. The potential is there for his return to address questions about loyalty and transformation and what endures under pressure that the setting has been building toward since the moment he said nevermore and walked into the dark. Whether that potential is realized is a question whose answer is being written right now in the ongoing development of the Warhammer 40,000 narrative by the people whose job it is to develop it. The evidence that the answer is coming, that the story is building towards something with Corax specifically, is in the lore that has accumulated around him in recent years, in the confirmation that he is alive, and that his capabilities are formidable, and that the encounter with Lorgar happened, and that the trajectory of the current narrative creates space and need for exactly what he represents. The shadow is still out there, the raven is still flying, somewhere in the dark, and the story, as the Raven Guard have been insisting for 10,000 years, is not over. Final word: what this story is really about. The return of Corvus Corax is not just a story about one Primarch. It is not even just a story about the Raven Guard or the Eye of Terror or what 10,000 years of transformation does to a being whose fundamental nature is connection to shadow and darkness. It is a story about what the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting is trying to say at its best, about what that grim darkness actually means, and what the right response to it is. The grimdark aesthetic, the unrelenting darkness, and the eternal war, and the sense that hope is always temporary, and every victory is always partial, exists in the setting for a reason. It is not there to be depressing. It is there to make the choices that characters make within it meaningful. In a setting where everything is easy and victories are final and the darkness always retreats before sufficient heroism, the choices that define those heroes cost nothing and therefore mean nothing. In a setting where the darkness is real and persistent and not easily overcome, every choice to keep going, every act of loyalty, maintained under conditions that make loyalty genuinely difficult, every moment of refusing to let the darkness define what you are, carries genuine weight. Corvus Corax, refusing to become what the Eye of Terror tried to make him, maintaining the core purpose that defined him across 10,000 years of transformation in the worst possible environment, is that kind of choice. Repeated continuously, for 10,000 years, without witness and without reward, and without any external validation that the choice was the right one. That is what the Warhammer 40,000 setting looks like at its best. Not heroes who triumph easily, but beings who choose correctly under impossible pressure, over and over, across timescales that mortal understanding cannot easily process. That is the return of Corvus Corax. That is what changes everything. Not the tactical capabilities, not the intelligence value, not the operational potential to pursue Daemon Primarchs into the warp, and finally end what the heresy started. All of those things matter, and matter enormously, for the practical shape of the conflict. But what changes everything at the deepest level is the demonstration that the darkness spent 10,000 years on the most powerful instrument at its disposal, and could not corrupt what it was trying to corrupt. The Raven returns. The Nevermore was a pause, not an ending. Deliverance waits for its deliverer. And that, in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, is enough to matter. Thank you for being here all the way to the end of this one. It means everything that you stayed for the full journey. Corvus Corax deserves the full treatment, and I hope this gave him something close to it. Please subscribe if you are not already. Drop that comment with where you are in the world right now. Share this with someone who loves these stories, and take care of yourselves out there. Until next time, the Raven always comes back.